Under the cover of darkness, cartel trucks swarmed the quiet farmland, torches in hand and weapons at the ready. But as they moved closer, they failed to notice the silent figure watching from the shadows. An ex-Green Beret sniper who had just decided this would be their last mistake. The farm sat on the outskirts of a small, forgotten town in Texas. Rows of cornfields stretched as far as the eye could see, swaying gently in the warm evening breeze. The farmhouse was old but sturdy, its wooden beams weathered by decades of storms and sunlight. This was home to Henry Walsh, a man who appeared to the world as nothing more than a quiet farmer tending to his land. Henry preferred this life, simple, peaceful, and far removed from the chaos of the outside world. Every morning he woke before the sun, feeding the chickens, mending fences, and checking on his crops. His neighbors knew little about him other than his polite nods and occasional help fixing their tractors. To them he was just that quiet man up on the hill. But Henry's calm demeanor hid a past he had buried deep. The scars on his hands were not from farming tools, but from combat missions. The precision in his movements came not from years of tending to crops, but from decades of sniper training as a Green Beret. Henry had walked away from the military to find peace, leaving behind a world of violence and war. Yet, even as he turned, his back on that life, the instincts never left him. He could still hear the faint echoes of battles fought long ago. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and red, Henry sat on his porch, sipping coffee from a worn mug. His dog Max lay by his feet, ears twitching at the distant sounds of crickets. For a moment all was quiet, peaceful, just as Henry liked it. But peace, he knew, was a fragile thing. In the distance, a faint rumble broke the silence. Henry's sharp eyes narrowed as he scanned the horizon. Dust clouds rose above the dirt road leading to his farm. Trucks, 3 of them, were speeding toward his property, their engines growling louder with every passing second. Henry stood slowly, placing his mug down on the porch railing. His hand instinctively brushed against the scar on his forearm, a reminder of a life he had sworn to leave behind. The trucks came to a screeching halt just outside his gate. The doors slammed open, and a group of men stepped out, their laughter echoing across the field. These were not locals. They were cartel enforcers, rough, armed, and full of arrogance. Their leader, a wiry man with a smug grin, stepped forward. He carried a torch in one hand and a rifle slung over his shoulder. "Nice place you got here," the man called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "Too nice for someone like you." Henry said nothing, his face calm but his mind already working. He noticed the way the men moved, their overconfidence, their lack of discipline. They were dangerous but sloppy. Easy targets for someone trained to assess threats in seconds. The leader gestured to the others. "Burn it," he ordered, tossing the torch toward Henry's fields. Henry's jaw tightened as flames began to spread across his crops. The laughter of the cartel men grated against his nerves, but he stayed rooted in place, watching their every move. This was not the time to act. Not yet. The leader turned to Henry, sneering. "You have 1 week to get off this land. Tell anyone, and it won't just be your crops that burn." The men piled back into their trucks, leaving the fire to rage behind them. As they drove off, their taillights disappeared into the darkness, but Henry's gaze remained fixed on the horizon. He knew they would return, and when they did, they wouldn't leave empty-handed. Henry turned and walked into his house. His steps were slow, deliberate, as if the weight of his past had finally caught up to him. Upstairs, in a dusty attic, sat a locked chest he hadn't opened in years. He climbed the stairs, his footsteps echoing in the quiet house. As he unlocked the chest, the memories flooded back, missions in faraway lands, the adrenaline of combat, the lives he had saved and the ones he couldn't. Inside the chest was everything he thought he had left behind: a sniper rifle, a combat knife, And a worn beret. Henry stared at the rifle for a long moment before picking it up. His hands moved instinctively, assembling it with precision that hadn't dulled with time. He wasn't just a farmer anymore. The cartel had awakened the man he once was, and they were about to realize their mistake. The fire burned well into the night, its orange glow flickering against the walls of Henry's farmhouse. He stood by the window, his eyes fixed on the charred remains of his crops. The once thriving field had been reduced to ashes, and the smell of smoke lingered in the air. But Henry's mind wasn't on the destruction. Instead, he was planning. Every movement of the cartel earlier, every word they had spoken, replayed in his mind like a chess game. They thought they had instilled fear. What they had done was wake a man trained to operate in the most dangerous battlefields in the world. The next morning, Henry began his preparations. His first step was reinforcing the weak points on his property. The barn, fences, and even the farmhouse itself were systematically fortified. He repurposed old tools, ropes, and spare parts into makeshift traps. Nails were hammered into wooden planks and buried beneath hay, creating hidden dangers for anyone who stepped out of line. He rigged tripwires across the entry points of the farm, connected to alarm systems made from old tin cans. Henry wasn't just protecting his land, he was building a battlefield. Meanwhile, the news of the cartel's raid spread through the small town. Most of the locals avoided confrontation with the cartel, fearing the consequences. Sheriff Walker, a middle-aged man with a reputation for being cautious, visited Henry to assess the damage. As the sheriff approached the porch, Henry greeted him with his usual calm demeanor. "Henry, I heard about the raid," the sheriff said, glancing toward the blackened field. "You know these men don't take kindly to resistance." Henry nodded, his expression unreadable. "I'm not looking for trouble, Sheriff, but trouble found me." The sheriff sighed, removing his hat and wiping his brow. "Look, I can't officially help you. We're outnumbered, outgunned, and these people don't leave witnesses." Henry met the sheriff's gaze, his voice low and steady. "I don't need help. Just stay out of the way." The sheriff hesitated, sensing the weight behind Henry's words. There was something in his tone, something resolute and unyielding. It was clear Henry wasn't going to back down. With a reluctant nod, the sheriff left, muttering a quiet, "Good luck." As the days passed, Henry's preparations intensified. He opened the attic chest once again, pulling out his old military gear. The sniper rifle he had once used on covert missions was cleaned and calibrated. He laid out maps of his property, marking entry points and high vantage positions. His hands moved with the precision of a man who had done this countless times before. Every detail was considered: where to strike, how to escape, and how to outthink an enemy that thrived on fear. The cartel, meanwhile, was plotting their return. At a safe house on the outskirts of town, Miguel Vargas, the cartel leader, sat at a table surrounded by his men. Miguel was ruthless and calculated, a man who had built his empire through intimidation and violence. His right-hand man, Luis, recounted the events of the raid with a sneer. The old man didn't even put up a fight, Luis said, laughing. "We burned his fields and he just stood there." Miguel leaned forward, his sharp eyes narrowing. "Farmers like him don't usually cause trouble, but make no mistake, if he tries anything, we'll make an example out of him." Luis nodded, but there was unease in the room. The cartel was used to dealing with civilians who cowered in fear. What they didn't know was that Henry Walsh wasn't a typical civilian. The night before the cartel's planned return, Henry sat on his porch, sharpening his combat knife. The moonlight glinted off the blade as he tested its edge. His dog, Max, lay by his side, ears twitching at every distant sound. The quiet was heavy, but it was the kind of silence Henry had grown familiar with during his years in the military. It wasn't peace, it was the calm before the storm. As midnight approached, the sound of engines broke the stillness. Henry's eyes narrowed as he spotted headlights in the distance. The cartel was coming back, and this time they weren't just here to intimidate. Henry moved silently into the shadows, his rifle slung over his shoulder and his mind razor-sharp. The traps were set, the land was prepared, and he was ready. The first truck came to a halt near the barn, and armed men spilled out, their boots crunching against the gravel. Luis stepped forward, holding a flashlight that cut through the darkness. "Come out, old man," he shouted, his voice echoing across the property. "We know you're here." From the shadows, Henry watched, his breathing steady and controlled. He had the high ground, perched in a tree with his rifle aimed at the group. The cartels spread out, unaware of the dangers hidden beneath their feet. One man tripped a wire, triggering a trap that sent a heavy log swinging down and knocking him to the ground. Chaos erupted as the cartels scrambled to regroup, their confidence shaken. Luis cursed, ordering his men to spread out further, but every step they took brought them closer to another trap. Nails hidden beneath hay pierced boots, and wires connected to old cans created noise, revealing their positions. Henry moved like a ghost, taking down targets with precision. A single shot rang out, and one of the enforcers fell to the ground. Another shot followed, and then another. The cartel was outmatched, their arrogance turning to fear. "Where is he?" Luis shouted, his voice trembling. Miguel, who had stayed back in the truck, stepped out, his anger boiling over. He grabbed a rifle and barked orders, trying to regain control. But Henry was relentless. He used the darkness to his advantage, striking from unseen angles and retreating before the cartel could react. The land had become a battlefield, and Henry was its master. As the night wore on, the cartel's numbers dwindled. Panic set in as the men realized they weren't dealing with a helpless farmer. They were facing a trained soldier, a man who had spent years perfecting the art of survival and combat. Henry's calculated strikes left them disoriented and desperate. By the time dawn broke, the farm was silent once more. The cartel's trucks were abandoned, their enforcers defeated. Henry emerged from the shadows, his rifle still in hand, his expression calm but resolute. He surveyed the land, his traps and tactics having done their job. The fight wasn't over, but this battle had been won. The fire burned well into the night, its orange glow flickering against the walls of Henry's farmhouse. He stood by the window, his eyes fixed on the charred remains of his crops. The once thriving field had been reduced to ashes, and the smell of smoke lingered in the air. But Henry's mind wasn't on the destruction. Instead, he was planning. Every movement of the cartel earlier, every word they had spoken, replayed in his mind like a chess game. They thought they had instilled fear. What they had done was wake a man trained to operate in the most dangerous battlefields in the world. The next morning, Henry began his preparations. His first step was reinforcing the weak points on his property. The barn, fences, and even the farmhouse itself were systematically fortified. He repurposed old tools, ropes, and spare parts into makeshift traps. Nails were hammered into wooden planks and buried beneath hay, creating hidden dangers for anyone who stepped out of line. He rigged tripwires across the entry points of the farm, connected to alarm systems made from old tin cans. Henry wasn't just protecting his land, he was building a battlefield. Meanwhile, the news of the cartel's raid spread through the small town. Most of the locals avoided confrontation with the cartel, fearing the consequences. Sheriff Walker, a middle-aged man with a reputation for being cautious, visited Henry to assess the damage. As the sheriff approached the porch, Henry greeted him with his usual calm demeanor. The sheriff said, glancing toward the blackened field. "You know these men don't take kindly to resistance." Henry nodded, his expression unreadable. "I'm not looking for trouble, Sheriff, but trouble found me." The sheriff sighed, removing his hat and wiping his brow. "Look, I can't officially help you. We're outnumbered, outgunned, and these people don't leave witnesses." Henry met the sheriff's gaze, his voice low and steady. "I don't need help. Just stay out of the way." The sheriff hesitated, sensing the weight behind Henry's words. There was something in his tone, something resolute and unyielding. It was clear Henry wasn't going to back down. With a reluctant nod, the sheriff left, muttering a quiet, "Good luck." As the days passed, Henry's preparations intensified. He opened the attic chest once again, pulling out his old military gear. The sniper rifle he had once used on covert missions was cleaned and calibrated. He laid out maps of his property, marking entry points and high vantage positions. His hands moved with the precision of a man who had done this countless times before. Every detail was considered: where to strike, how to escape, and how to outthink an enemy that thrived on fear. The cartel, meanwhile, was plotting their return. At a safe house on the outskirts of town, Miguel Vargas, the cartel leader, sat at a table surrounded by his men. Miguel was ruthless and calculated, a man who had built his empire through intimidation and violence. His right-hand man, Luis, recounted the events of the raid with a sneer. "The old man didn't even put up a fight," Luis said, laughing. "We burned his fields, and he just stood there." Miguel leaned forward, his sharp eyes narrowing. "Farmers like him don't usually cause trouble, but make no mistake, if he tries anything, we'll make an example out of him." Luis nodded. But there was unease in the room. The cartel was used to dealing with civilians who cowered in fear. What they didn't know was that Henry Walsh wasn't a typical civilian. The night before the cartel's planned return, Henry sat on his porch, sharpening his combat knife. The moonlight glinted off the blade as he tested its edge. His dog, Max, lay by his side, ears twitching at every distant sound. The quiet was heavy, but it was the kind of silence Henry had grown familiar with during his years in the military. It wasn't peace, it was the calm before the storm. As midnight approached, the sound of engines broke the stillness. Henry's eyes narrowed as he spotted headlights in the distance. The cartel was coming back, and this time they weren't just here to intimidate. Henry moved silently into the shadows, his rifle slung over his shoulder and his mind razor-sharp. The traps were set, the land was prepared, and he was ready. The first truck came to a halt near the barn, and armed men spilled out, their boots crunching against the gravel. Luis stepped forward, holding a flashlight that cut through the darkness. "Come out, old man," he shouted, his voice echoing across the property. "We know you're here." From the shadows, Henry watched, his breathing steady and controlled. He had the high ground, perched in a tree with his rifle aimed at the group. The cartel spread out, unaware of the dangers hidden beneath their feet. One man tripped a wire, triggering a trap that sent a heavy log swinging down and knocking him to the ground. Chaos erupted as the cartel scrambled to regroup, their confidence shaken. Luis cursed, ordering his men to spread out further. But every step they took brought them closer to another trap. Nails hidden beneath hay pierced boots, and wires connected to old cans created noise, revealing their positions. Henry moved like a ghost, taking down targets with precision. A single shot rang out, and one of the enforcers fell to the ground. Another shot followed, and then another. The cartel was outmatched, their arrogance turning to fear. "Where is—" "Oh, hi!" Luis shouted, his voice trembling. Miguel, who had stayed back in the truck, stepped out, his anger boiling over. He grabbed a rifle and barked orders, trying to regain control. But Henry was relentless. He used the darkness to his advantage, striking from unseen angles and retreating before the cartel could react. The land had become a battlefield, and Henry was its master. As the night wore on, the cartel's numbers dwindled. Panic set in as the men realized they weren't dealing with a helpless farmer. They were facing a trained soldier, a man who had spent years perfecting the art of survival and combat. Henry's calculated strikes left them disoriented and desperate. By the time dawn broke, the farm was silent once more. The cartel's trucks were abandoned, their enforcers defeated. Henry emerged from the shadows, his rifle still in hand, his expression calm but resolute. He surveyed the land, his traps and tactics having done their job. The fight wasn't over, but this battle had been won. The rising sun painted the sky in hues of red and gold, but the battlefield that Henry's farm had become was far from tranquil. The once laughing cartel members were now scattered, bruised and battered, their confidence shattered, but not all of them had fallen. From the shadows, Henry observed the remaining men regrouping near their trucks, led by Miguel Vargas himself. Miguel's sharp eyes scanned the landscape, his expression furious yet calculating. This wasn't the outcome he had expected. "He's one man," Miguel growled, gripping his rifle tightly. "We are the cartel. We will not leave here defeated." Luis, limping from a gash in his leg caused by one of Henry's traps, looked less confident. "Boss, this isn't just any farmer. He's something else. We should leave and come back with more men." Miguel sneered, shoving Luis back. "Cowards, run! We finish this now." From his vantage point in the tree line, Henry watched. Their every move, his rifle steady in his hands. He could see the cracks in their unity, the fear spreading like wildfire among them. But Miguel wasn't going to back down easily, and Henry knew the final confrontation would have to be decisive. He inhaled deeply, centering himself, and then made his move. A single shot rang out, echoing across the farm. Miguel's head whipped around as one of his men collapsed to the ground, clutching his shoulder. Panic rippled through the group as they scrambled for cover behind the trucks, shouting over each other. Henry had chosen his target carefully. Not a fatal shot, but one meant to send a message. "You're not safe here. Stay together," Miguel barked, his voice edged with frustration. "Find him and take him out." The cartel spread out cautiously, their weapons drawn. But every step they took brought them deeper into Henry's territory, a place that now belonged to him, not them. Another trap triggered, and one of the enforcers cried out as a concealed spike punctured his boot. The chaos deepened, and Henry struck again, this time taking down a man who had wandered too far from the group. Miguel's rage boiled over. He fired blindly into the trees, hoping to draw Henry out. "Show yourself, you coward!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the still air. Henry moved like a shadow, silent and precise. He stayed hidden, using the terrain to his advantage. The barn, now reinforced with traps and vantage points, became his fortress. He climbed to the loft, where he had a clear view of the remaining cartel members. From there, he took out another target with a perfectly placed shot, the man dropping before he even realized what had happened. Miguel's frustration turned to unease as he realized they were being outmaneuvered. He gestured for Luis to follow him toward the farmhouse, hoping to flush Henry out by destroying his home. "If we can't find him, we'll burn him out," Miguel snarled, grabbing a gas can from the truck. Henry watched them approach, his jaw tightening. The farmhouse was more than just a building to him. It was his sanctuary, the life he had built after years of chaos. But he wasn't going to let them take it, not without a fight. As Miguel and Luis reached the porch, Henry emerged from the shadows, his rifle slung over his shoulder and a combat knife in his hand. The two men froze, startled by his sudden appearance. Miguel quickly raised his rifle, but Henry was faster. With a precise throw, the knife sailed through the air, embedding itself in Luis's arm. The man cried out, dropping his weapon and falling to the ground. Miguel turned his weapon toward Henry, but before he could fire, Henry closed the distance between them with startling speed. Using his military training, Henry disarmed Miguel with a swift, practiced motion, sending the rifle skidding across the porch. The two men stood face to face, the tension crackling between them. Miguel, still defiant, sneered. "You think you've won? You're just one man. You can't stop us all." Henry's expression was calm, his voice low and steady. "I don't have to stop all of you, just you." Miguel lunged at Henry, pulling a knife from his belt. The two men clashed in a brutal hand-to-hand fight, their movements fast and feral. Miguel's strikes were wild and desperate, while Henry's were calculated and precise. It didn't take long for Henry to gain the upper hand, pinning Miguel to the ground. With the cartel leader at his mercy, Henry pressed the knife to Miguel's throat. For a moment, the silence was deafening. Miguel's bravado was gone, replaced by fear as he stared up at the man who had dismantled his operation with nothing but skill and determination. But Henry didn't strike the killing blow. Instead, he stood, pulling Miguel to his feet and tying his hands with a length of rope. "You'll answer for what you've done," Henry said, his voice cold. "Not to me, but to the people whose lives you've destroyed." Miguel spat on the ground, his pride wounded but his life spared. "This isn't over," he hissed as Henry pushed him toward the truck. Henry's gaze hardened. "It is for you." By the time the sun fully rose, the remaining cartel enforcers had fled, their leader captured, and their power in the region broken. Henry stood at the edge of his property, watching as Miguel was loaded into the back of a police car. Sheriff Walker, who had arrived with reinforcements after hearing the commotion, gave Henry a respectful nod. "You've done this town a service," the sheriff said. "We'll make sure he pays for what he's done." Henry didn't respond. He simply watched as the convoy of police vehicles disappeared down the dirt road. For the first time in days, the farm was quiet again. As Henry walked back to his farmhouse, his dog Max trotted by his side. The land bore the scars of the battle, burned crops, broken fences, and scattered debris, but it was still his. And that was all that mattered. He paused on the porch, looking out over the horizon. The fight had been won, but he knew the peace he had fought for was fragile. Still, for now, it was enough. Henry sat down, the weight of the night settling on his shoulders. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. Anyone who thought they could take what was his would face the full force of a man who had once been trained to end wars. The sun had fully risen, bathing the farm in a soft golden light. The chaos of the previous night had given way to an eerie stillness. Henry stood at the edge of his field, his gaze sweeping across the land that he had fought so fiercely to protect. The smell of smoke lingered in the air, a reminder of the damage done, but the fire in his heart burned brighter. His dog, Max, wagged his tail gently at his feet, sensing his master's resolve. The sheriff's convoy had disappeared down the dusty road, taking Miguel Vargas, the cartel leader, and the remaining enforcers into custody. Though the battle had been won, Henry knew the fight wasn't over. The cartel's reach extended far beyond this small town, but for now they had been dealt a blow that would ripple through their operations. He had sent a message. This land, his life, was not up for taking. Neighbors began to gather at the edge of his property, curious and cautious. For years, Henry had been a quiet figure in their lives, a man who kept to himself, who avoided small talk and town gatherings, but today they saw him in a different light. They saw the man who had stood up to the cartel, who had protected their town when no one else dared. An elderly farmer stepped forward, his hat in his hands. "Henry," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "I don't know how to thank you. What you did, it's more than anyone could have asked for." Henry nodded, his face calm but his words deliberate. "I didn't do it for thanks. I did it because it needed to be done," the group murmured among themselves, admiration and respect evident in their eyes. For the first time, Henry felt a connection to the people he had lived near for so long. They weren't just neighbors anymore. They were a community, one he had fought to protect. Over the next few days, the townsfolk came together to help Henry rebuild. They brought tools, seeds, and supplies, patching up the damage to his barn, and helping replant his fields. The scars of the battle remained, but so did the resolve to restore what had been lost. Henry worked alongside them, his usually stoic demeanor softening as he realized the strength that came from unity. One evening, as the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, Henry sat on his porch, watching the newly planted crops sway. In the gentle breeze, Max lay beside him, his head resting on Henry's boot. The air was quiet, But it wasn't the silence of isolation. It was the peace that came from knowing his home and his community was safe, at least for now. A black SUV pulled up the driveway, its headlights cutting through the dimming light. Henry tensed, his hand instinctively moving toward the rifle leaning against the wall. But when the door opened, a man in a dark suit stepped out, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Henry Walsh?" the man asked, his voice calm and authoritative. Henry nodded, his sharp eyes scanning the stranger. The man stepped closer, his expression respectful but serious. "My name is Agent Carter. I work with a federal task force focused on dismantling organized crime. What you did here, it's made waves. You've disrupted one of the cartel's key operations, and frankly, we could use someone like you." Henry leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "I've done my time, Agent. I'm not looking to get back into that life." Carter nodded, understanding. "I get it. But just know this. You've shown people that they don't have to live in fear, that they can fight back. That kind of courage is rare, and it's contagious." With that, the agent handed Henry a card and left, his SUV disappearing down the same road the sheriff's convoy had traveled days earlier. Henry stared at the card for a moment before tucking it into his pocket. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing. He wasn't just a farmer anymore. He was a protector, a symbol of resistance against those who thought they could take whatever they wanted. As the stars began to appear in the night sky, Henry stood and walked inside, the weight of the day slowly lifting. The fight had changed him, reminded him of who he was and what he was capable of. He wasn't running from his past anymore. Instead, he was embracing it, using it to protect what mattered most. The farm was quiet once more, but the legacy of the man who had defended it would echo far beyond the fields. The days turned into weeks, and Henry's farm slowly began to return to normal, though the events of the cartel raid had left their mark on both the land and the man. The fields were replanted, the fences repaired, and the scars of battle faded under the steady rhythm of hard work. Yet the quiet life Henry had built for himself no longer felt the same. The townspeople treated him differently now. Everywhere he went, there were nods of respect, quiet thanks, and words of admiration. Children whispered stories about the farmer who defeated the cartel, their wide eyes filled with awe. To them, Henry was a hero, a legend. But to Henry, he was just a man who had done what needed to be done. One morning, as he worked on repairing the barn roof, a young boy from the town approached him, clutching a worn notebook to his chest. Henry climbed down the ladder, wiping his hands on his jeans as the boy hesitated at the edge of the fence. "Mr. Walsh," the boy said timidly, "is it true? Are you really a hero?" Henry crouched down to meet the boy's eyes, his expression softening. "A hero? No, son. I'm just a man protecting what's his." The boy's face lit up with determination. "I want to be like you someday. I want to protect people too." Henry smiled faintly, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Then remember this. Strength doesn't come from fighting. It comes from knowing what you're fighting for." The boy nodded, his grip on the notebook tightening as he ran back toward the town. Henry watched him go, a flicker of hope stirring in his chest. Maybe, just maybe, his actions had sparked something greater, a sense of courage and resilience in those who needed it most. That evening, as Henry sat on his porch with Max by his side, he found himself reflecting on the path that had brought him here, the battles he had fought, the lives he had saved, and the losses he had endured. They had all shaped him into the man he was today. For years, he had tried to leave that part of himself behind, but now he realized it wasn't something to be forgotten. It was something to be embraced. His thoughts were interrupted by the rumble of a truck pulling up his driveway. It was Sheriff Walker. The sheriff stepped out, his hat in hand, and approached the porch with a serious expression. "Henry," the sheriff began, "I've got news. Miguel Vargas and his men are behind bars, but the cartel isn't happy. Word is they might send someone else to finish what he started." Henry's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "Let them try." The sheriff nodded, a glimmer of respect in his eyes. "I figured you'd say that. Just know you've got people in town who have your back now. You're not alone in this." Henry watched the sheriff leave, his resolve hardening. The fight wasn't over. It likely never would be. But Henry wasn't afraid. He had faced worse odds before, and he would do it again if it meant protecting the life he had built. As the stars filled the night sky, Henry stood at the edge of his property, the cool breeze brushing against his face. The land stretched out before him, quiet and vast, a reminder of what he was fighting for. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. Anyone who tried to take what was his would learn the hard way that this farmer was far more than they ever expected. The night was calm, but Henry's resolve burned brighter than ever. He had reclaimed his home, his peace, and his purpose, and no one would take it from him again. The days settled into a fragile routine. The townsfolk carried on with their lives, emboldened by the story of Henry Walsh, the farmer who had stood up to the cartel. Yet a shadow lingered over the quiet town. Rumors of retaliation spread in, whispers, carried by travelers and traders passing through. The cartel was not known to forgive or forget, and the thought of their return loomed over everyone like a dark cloud. Henry was well aware of this. He spent his days working on the farm, but his nights were spent in preparation. He reinforced his traps, calibrated his rifle, and mapped every inch of his land. This wasn't paranoia. It was prudence. He knew the cartel operated on power and fear, and his defiance had challenged both. One evening, a knock on his door startled him. Henry rarely had visitors, and Max barked sharply, pacing by the door. When Henry opened it, he found a woman standing on the porch. She was in her mid-30s, with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor. She carried a briefcase, and her stance was that of someone who had seen her fair share of danger. "Mr. Walsh?" she asked, her tone professional. "That's me," Henry replied cautiously, his hand resting lightly on the doorframe. The woman extended a hand. "Agent Elena Moore. I'm with the Federal Task Force on Organized Crime. I've been following your case." Henry didn't shake her hand. Instead, he leaned against the doorframe, studying her carefully. "What's the government want with me?" Elena lowered her hand, her expression remaining neutral. "What you did here sent a message, not just to the cartel, but to the people they terrorize. You've shown that they're not untouchable. We believe you could help us dismantle their operations further." Henry raised an eyebrow. "I'm not interested in working for the government again. I've done my time." "I understand," Elena said. "But this isn't just about you. The cartel won't stop with you. They'll come for this town, for the people you've fought to protect. We can help ensure they never have the chance." Henry's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, silence hung between them. Finally he spoke, his voice low and firm. "If they come, I'll handle it." Elena nodded, sensing his resolve. She placed a card on the porch railing. "If you change your mind, or if things escalate, call me. We've got resources you could use." With that, she turned and walked back to her car, leaving Henry to his thoughts. He stared at the card for a long moment before tucking it into his pocket. He didn't trust the government, but he wasn't foolish enough to ignore the possibility of needing allies. As the days turned into weeks, the tension in the air grew thicker. Henry's instincts told him that it was only a matter of time before the cartel made their move. He didn't know when or how, but he knew they would come, and when they did, he would be ready. One quiet night, as he sat on the porch with Max by his side, the faint sound of distant engines reached his ears. His hand immediately went to the rifle leaning against the wall. The engines grew louder, and the faint glow of headlights appeared on the horizon. "They're coming," Henry muttered to himself, his voice steady. He stood, his mind already calculating his next steps. This time, it wouldn't just be a defense of his farm. This time, he would make sure they never came back. The fight wasn't over, but Henry Walsh was no stranger to battles. The cartel had underestimated him once. They wouldn't live to make that mistake again. The distant roar of engines grew louder, breaking the stillness of the night. Henry stood motionless on his porch, his rifle resting against his shoulder. Max growled low, sensing the tension in his master's stance. The headlights on the horizon multiplied, spreading like a line of fire ants crawling toward the farm. This wasn't a small group of enforcers. The cartel had sent everything they had. Henry exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cool night air. His preparations over the past weeks had been meticulous. Every trap, every vantage point, every escape route had been carefully planned. Tonight would be the true test of whether his skill and determination could hold against overwhelming odds. As the convoy of trucks reached the outer edge of the property, the engines died, and the silence that followed was deafening. Shadows emerged, men armed with rifles and machetes, spreading out across the field like wolves closing in on their prey. At the center of the group stood a man Henry didn't recognize, tall and broad-shouldered, with a scar running down his left cheek. This was no ordinary enforcer. This was someone sent to finish the job Miguel Vargas had failed to complete. The man stepped forward, his voice booming across the farm. "Henry Walsh, you've made quite a name for yourself, but tonight your story ends." Henry didn't respond. Instead, he slipped silently into the shadows of the barn, his boots making no sound on the wooden floor. His rifle was ready, and his eyes scanned the field through the scope. The cartel had numbers on their side, but Henry had the advantage of knowing every inch of the terrain. The first trap triggered as one of the enforcers stepped on a hidden tripwire. A deafening explosion erupted, scattering debris and sending men diving for cover. The shockwave created a moment of chaos, and Henry used it to his advantage. He fired his first shot, taking down the cartel member closest to the house. Panic spread quickly among the men as more traps activated, spiked boards concealed under loose dirt, wires pulling makeshift alarms, and hidden pits causing confusion. In the darkness, Henry moved like a ghost, never staying in one place long enough to be seen. Each shot was precise, every move calculated. The scarred leader barked orders, trying to regain control. "Spread out! Find him! He's just one man!" But his words betrayed his own uncertainty. The men hesitated, the realization dawning on them that this wasn't a simple raid. It was a battle they weren't prepared for. Henry's traps had turned the farm into a fortress, and his skill with the rifle was unmatched. In the midst of the chaos, Henry climbed to the loft of the barn, taking a higher vantage point. From there he spotted the scarred leader standing near one of the trucks, shouting into a radio. Henry steadied his rifle, his finger hovering over the trigger. But he didn't fire, not yet. He wanted the leader to feel the weight of the fear his men were experiencing. Instead, Henry focused on picking off the enforcers one by one, each shot silencing another threat. The leader's frustration grew as his men fell around him. Finally, he grabbed a rifle and started toward the barn, flanked by two of his remaining men. Henry anticipated their approach. He slipped down from the loft, silently making his way through the shadows of the barn. As the leader and his men entered, Henry struck. A knife in hand, he moved with the precision of a predator, taking down the first man before the others even realized what was happening. The leader spun around, his rifle raised, but Henry was already behind him. He disarmed the man with a swift motion, the rifle clattering to the ground. The scarred leader swung a fist, but Henry dodged easily, his combat training taking over. The fight was brutal and raw, two men battling for survival in the darkened barn. Finally, Henry gained the upper hand, pinning the leader to the ground. His knife was pressed against the man's throat, but he paused. Killing him would be easy, but Henry wasn't looking for vengeance. He wanted the cartel to know that this was a fight they could never win. "Leave," Henry growled, his voice low and deadly. "Tell whoever sent you that this farm is off limits. You come back, you die." The leader stared up at him, his defiance wavering under Henry's cold gaze. Slowly, Henry released him, stepping back as the man scrambled to his feet. He grabbed his injured men and retreated, shouting for the others to fall back. The remaining cartel members fled into the night, their trucks disappearing into the darkness. As the sound of engines faded, Henry stood in the middle of the field, his chest rising and falling with each breath. The farm was quiet once more, but the scars of the battle remained. He looked around at the destruction, burned crops, shattered fences, and the remnants of his traps scattered across the land. Max trotted over, nudging Henry's leg with his nose. Henry knelt down, resting a hand on the dog's head. "It's over," he said softly, though he knew the fight would never truly be over. The cartel would regroup, but they would think twice before returning here. For now, the farm was safe, and Henry Walsh, the farmer with the soul of a warrior, had proven once again that some battles are worth fighting, no matter the cost.